So welcome to this Icehouse podcast. With over 1 million Kiwis living overseas, we are second only to Ireland on a per capita basis, with some 20% of our native-born population living abroad. With the world being turned upside down with the global pandemic, our diaspora represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for New Zealand to connect with and utilise some of this talent for those that are intending to return. A recent survey by KEA indicated that over 30% of Kiwis intend to return to New Zealand in the next couple of years. So what do returning Kiwis think of home now? What are their challenges and expectations? What do they need to get reintegrated and connected into a changed New Zealand? KEA, the Kiwi Expat Association, has been connecting with onshore and offshore Kiwis around the world for many years. So to answer some of the questions for returning Kiwis, it's my great pleasure to welcome Toni Truslove, the CEO of KEA, to today's podcast. Welcome, Toni.
Hi, Gavin. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. So maybe for those people that don't know much about KEA, could you just give a brief overview of what the organisation is, how long it's been around?
Sure. So KEA's been around for almost 20 years now. It's really long-standing. Really, the main work for KEA is about connecting with our offshore Kiwi community and helping them to stay part of New Zealand from afar. And really, we do that currently through two main ways. The first one is we look at how we can support Kiwis to help export businesses. So as you mentioned earlier, we have this amazing natural advantage by having such a high percentage of our population living overseas, and they can be amazing ambassadors for New Zealand, but they can also be our eyes and ears in terms of what's happening in various industries. They can be building networks that can be helping those of us back here in New Zealand, particularly if we export businesses or businesses that are looking to go global. So the two main ways that we sort of help enable that community, that offshore community, to give back to New Zealand is via supporting export businesses. So KEA Connect is a service that's been around for about 12 years now, and that connects New Zealand businesses to that offshore Kiwi population. And those offshore Kiwis are able to help with mentorship, guidance, and also help on introduce to other people who might be helpful. And then
sorry to interrupt, is that connected to the Beachheads program? Is that similar to that, or is it working alongside it?
It's quite different to Beachheads. So Beachheads is, as I understand it, the NZTE service of advisors who can go around and work within businesses on a paid basis to help support them on certain projects or to deliver certain goals. The KEA Connect service is just purely introduction. So we don't sort of make placements of advisors into organizations, and they can be connections where there's a single conversation had and a bit of advice given, or they could be connections where there is an ongoing mentorship relationship built, but usually they're non-paid.
Right, so more of a pro bono, informal Kiwi to Kiwi type of thing.
Yeah.
And what about the other side? So that's going offshore. What about, more with COVID happening, there's the other thing happening, which is people coming back.
Yeah, and so that's great segue. That's the second way that that KEA is helping Kiwis to give back to New Zealand. There is, as you mentioned, there's a large number of Kiwis who are looking to come home at the moment. And that's really exciting for New Zealand because it's the first time in a number of decades that we have got more Kiwis wanting to come home than wanting to leave. And so this presents such an exciting human capital opportunity for New Zealand, but also because there are a number of industries where we have distinct labour shortages and talent gaps. So there's a real opportunity for us to engage these Kiwis offshore and help them to land in the right way back into New Zealand so that they can help plug these gaps and ultimately help drive productivity. So what KEA is doing in this space is through our program of survey work, we understand who is overseas and who is wanting to come home in the short term and in the long term. And we're working through delivering a talent platform that's actually due to launch in alpha phase within the coming weeks, that will look at supporting New Zealand businesses to connect directly with that talent. And that talent can often be hard to find for New Zealand companies. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack. So being able to leverage KEA's existing relationships and understanding of these offshore Kiwis to find potential talent is
it's one of the things I wanted to touch on. But before we go into that, maybe just a little bit about yourself. I remember meeting you, maybe a year ago now, and you recently returned from the UK. So you were one of those expat Kiwis. What aligned you and drew you to the KEA organisation?
Yeah. So I was an expat Kiwi. I lived and worked overseas for about 8 years, and I've been back in New Zealand for just over 4 years now. And that, you're absolutely right, was one of the things that drew me into KEA. Is I think when you go away, as a Kiwi, you automatically get this amazing reflection point where you become that much prouder of your Kiwi heritage, of the amazing work that goes on in New Zealand, the community, the innovation, and that distance being away and looking back on New Zealand just gives you this enormous pride. And so for me, when I came back to New Zealand, I really wanted to give back and find a way to use my sort of 8 years of offshore skills and experience to help support New Zealand businesses. But coming back, I didn't necessarily find coming back into New Zealand to be what I expected or as easy as I expected. And so when the opportunity came up to work with KEA and to find ways to leverage offshore experience for the good of New Zealand, it really attracted me. And I thought it was something that I could sort of help passionately build.
Yeah, look, I'm hearing that as well. A lot of expat Kiwis come back with a lot of experience. And not only do they want a bunch of other things which will come on, but one of the things I'm hearing is, how do they get back? How do they use some of those skills and experience they have to help the country that they call home? So what maybe you could kind of segue into some of the survey results, but maybe looking at the personal dimension as well, which are, what are some of the challenges and questions that Kiwis coming back have?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is that when you come back to New Zealand, it's going to be a very different place than what you left. I think a number of Kiwis coming home underestimate the challenges of adapting back into New Zealand. I think when you head overseas, you anticipate that there are going to be cultural challenges. You're going to have to navigate a labour market that's quite different. You're going to have to build connections. But as Kiwis coming home, we assume that we're going to be totally fine. It'll be exactly as we remember things, and it's not. And that came through quite strongly in our first survey, where we learnt that the vast majority of Kiwis who were looking to come home had been away for 10 years plus. And so, the New Zealand that they're coming home to is vastly different from the New Zealand that they left. And so that underestimating that can cause quite a bit of a shock, or almost like a reverse culture shock when you come back to New Zealand. And then I think some of the other challenges exist in the way that New Zealanders who haven't left view Kiwis coming back. I think one of the biggest things that struck me is that, tall poppy syndrome is very much alive and well in New Zealand. And often we can be quite threatened by Kiwis coming home with that offshore skills and experience, instead of embracing it and understanding the diversity opportunities that they're going to bring to organisations. And so I think that can be a real challenge, and it calls for Kiwis who are coming home to be quite empathetic to that, to think about how they can best introduce themselves and their skills to organisations, and just sort of step a little bit more cautiously than perhaps they thought they might have to. It's certainly not a case of a big welcome mat sort of being rolled out, which some Kiwis, I think, expect when they arrive home.
Yeah, I think, that echoes my experience. I was actually out of New Zealand for about 25 years. I left when I was in my late teens, and so the New Zealand that I came back to was quite different, as you can imagine. And obviously I was different as well after 25 years. But do you think that's changing? Do you think the attitudes, this tall poppy syndrome has been a kind of a bit like number 8 wire, a bit of a cliche associated with New Zealand's psyche. Do you think that's changing?
I would like to think that it is, but in our recent survey, its existence came through quite strongly in some of the responses that we had. So we surveyed Kiwis who had come back into New Zealand to understand their experience within the New Zealand employment market. Alongside that, we also surveyed a number of employees in New Zealand to understand their experience of engaging with offshore Kiwis as they return. So we're sort of really looking to get both sides of the coin. And what came through quite strongly was that Kiwi companies were saying that they valued these offshore skills and experiences, but that wasn't being felt by the employees or the prospective employees as they were going through that recruitment process. The data showed that many of our Kiwis were being discounted because they had this offshore experience and didn't have as much onshore experience. So I'd like to think that it is slowly changing, but I think we've still got a long way to go if you look at some of the KEA data.
Yeah, well, it's good to know that, organizations like KEA, and I certainly, from my experience with the Icehouse and other sort of ecosystem players, we're singing off the same hymn sheet, which is this is an incredible opportunity, and that we very much welcome talent coming back into New Zealand. We're desperately short of high-skilled, high-tech, international experience is a critical part of what will make New Zealand businesses more successful as we seek to export more as a percentage of our economy. So tell me a little bit about what you're hearing when they come back. Maybe a few challenges in terms of integration because of the tall poppy syndrome, but what are they looking for? What are the things that they need to find out quickly?
I think one of the biggest things that we know helps Kiwis be successful is building connections. So that can start even before they think about coming back to New Zealand, is really getting in and understanding the market, the industry that they're wanting to break into, and how they can build connections and relationships, because really New Zealand does thrive on relationships, even within employment and recruitment. And so building those relationships from afar, I think, before you arrive in New Zealand can be really essential. I think when Kiwis are coming back into New Zealand, often they've had more narrow roles overseas. I don't know about your offshore roles, Gavin, but I headed up quite a narrow but deep part of an organisation. And coming back into New Zealand, our roles here are much more generalist and much broader. And so you've got to be really cognizant of how you present your skills and what's transferable between an international market and a New Zealand market, and how you present that to prospective employers. That, I think, is definitely the number one sort of CV interview tip that we're hearing from our community is really valuable.
It's a balance, isn't it? I mean, you talk about the tall poppy syndrome and perhaps not wanting to overplay the depth of experience you have. But as you say, that many employers are looking for someone with broader skills. And in fact, my experience of working offshore is that some of the New Zealanders I work with, some of their major strengths were their ability to operate across different parts of the business, even though because of the scale of the businesses, it could afford people to specialize in specific areas. But you're right, yeah. So I think New Zealanders returning need to think more broadly about how they could integrate and service different parts of businesses, because 97% of enterprises in New Zealand have fewer than 20 people. So we are a nation of small, medium businesses.
Generalists.
Yeah, and you're right. When you're in a smaller business, you don't have many specialist departments. What other things are you hearing that Kiwis are looking for when they come back?
I think one of the more interesting aspects for me sits in the drivers of why Kiwis are coming home. So if we think about the context of Kiwis coming home after 10 years abroad, these are people who have really established careers, lives, businesses, often families overseas. And if you think about what might ignite their desire to shake that all up and move home to the other side of the world, it's often about family and about belonging back in their home country, particularly, when you go through something like a global pandemic. There really is nothing like the sense of security of home and of family.
Mm.
And so if you think about that as being a main driver for Kiwis coming home, what we're finding is that when they land here on the ground, they're not necessarily looking for the big roles with the high paying salaries, with the 70-hour weeks. They're looking for more meaningful work. And so therefore they are often coming home to take passion roles. Many of them are coming home with business ideas and looking to start sort of passion projects. But overall, they are looking, if they are looking for roles, they are looking to work for organizations that have real purpose. And so that's quite a different proposition than I think many employers expect for Kiwis coming home. They realize that they're not going to be earning the same salaries that they were offshore. They realize that the seniority or the size of the role is going to be somewhat smaller. So they are looking at more cultural and often sort of philanthropic angles to their work. And that's what's really enticing them, looking for ways that they're able to give back to their community.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I see at a personal level, but also from the folk that I connect with coming back. Some of the things that I also hear from people coming back is they're looking to invest. And investment, interestingly enough, is one way in which you can integrate into a network and get great connections. So, for example, Icehouse Ventures provides a community, a curated community of angel investors and wholesale investors who are looking to contribute to either financially or through mentorship and their experience to high growth startup companies. Yeah. So investment is certainly something we're hearing about.
I think seeing lots of Kiwis coming home wanting to start their own business. Is that your experience?
Yeah, there's some are. I think they're often want to contribute in some way, so be part of a high growth company. Maybe not, some of them would have the confidence and the entrepreneurial experience who have started business offshore, but often they want to just come back and either invest in the companies and take a sort of more executive in residence type approach, or some will dive in and take an investment plus an operational role in those companies. They represent, many of those companies, certainly the high growth companies, they see their future as global. So therefore they more highly value offshore experience than perhaps a smaller company would that's just domestically focused. So I think offshore experience and talent combined with some financial investment that some offshore Kiwis are prepared to put in makes them reasonably attractive and a pretty exciting and purposeful type of connection back into New Zealand.
Yeah.
Tell me about this survey that you did. So the survey, I know you've done a couple. I think one was about 6 months ago and a recent one came out. What are some of the other trends you're seeing for returning Kiwis?
So I think, one of the other interesting things that came through in the survey is just how different the experience of the last 18 months has been for offshore Kiwis versus onshore Kiwis. And so we saw that, a large number of our offshore Kiwis have been in some form of government or self-imposed lockdown for more than 18 months. And so, if you think about that as an experience for offshore Kiwis, it's a really incredibly challenging time. We also know that there's been challenges for many who have been wanting to come home with New Zealand's elimination strategy and the MIQ and borders. That has put pressure on them being able to come home and see family and friends. And so that's been a real challenge. But I think despite all of this, they remain incredibly connected and passionate about New Zealand and for New Zealand. And we saw that yes, there is a large percentage, an interestingly large percentage, who are still wanting to come home within the next couple of years. But of those who are choosing to remain offshore, a large percentage of those, I think it's about 70%, are proactively looking for ways that they can give back to New Zealand from overseas.
That's interesting. How are they doing that?
Well, doing it. So there's a number of ways that they're looking to do that. They are looking to offer their time through to New Zealand organisations through advisory and board positions. And that's something that personally I find really interesting. Here in New Zealand, we are amazing at coming up with ideas and fantastic innovations with which to build businesses around. But sometimes we can be not as good as at scaling those businesses to be real frontier firms. And so I think tapping into a Kiwi who lives overseas, but who potentially has a much broader experience of scaling businesses, of risk, and frankly, just much higher expectations in terms of what growth could be, and injecting that into, some of our startup boards within New Zealand, I think could present a really fantastic opportunity. And so I think, that's a great option for Kiwi overseas to give back.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, not only scale of experience, but also in-market experience. I know a number of startups that have done well here and then are looking to expand. What better to sort of get an advisory board, or even a director position in market with New Zealand roots and local domain expertise.
Absolutely. And then, a number of other Kiwis are looking to open their networks and share their experience in a less formal relationship with businesses. So as I mentioned before, the KEA Connect service, which has been around for 12 odd years, which is specifically designed at connecting New Zealand businesses who are either currently exporting or who are looking to export, connecting those with those Kiwis offshore in those markets. I think it's really important to them to remain part of New Zealand. And it's certainly fantastic for us as a country, when we do have such a small population, having the diversity and the perspective, the global perspective that can come from having such a high percentage of our population existing and living overseas, just presents such a fantastic opportunity for New Zealand. And I think the ongoing work for KEA will be finding more ways to keep those offshore Kiwis part of New Zealand and finding the opportunities for them to give back and stay involved.
Good. Well, look, I look forward to continue working with KEA. We have very complementary types of connections and offerings. The Icehouse with the investment community, the small medium enterprise business sector, mostly mid-sized small medium businesses, plus also some co-working space. I know when I came back into New Zealand, it was good to kind of just sit in a place where there's vibrancy and serendipitous connections. And actually, Auckland is blessed now with a lot more co-working environments than when I left New Zealand, of which the Icehouse is just one. Any final words of advice or thoughts before we close the podcast, Toni?
I think, for me, it's just encouraging all of us here in New Zealand, whether we are business owners or looking to start a business or we're employers, just to be thinking about offshore Kiwis and the value, the global perspectives that they could bring into New Zealand. And there is a big wide world of opportunity out there. There is so much relevance that New Zealand has to the world, and so much relevance that the world can have to New Zealand. And these offshore Kiwis are a real essential connection point for us.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, Toni. Pleasure talking to you again.